elderly people's ankles. Yeah, it actually works better than the other title that we had working, which was characterizing the artifacts of legacy security and technology and their effects on modern applications of authentication or authorization. But before we get into this, let me introduce myself. Hi, my name's Josh. I'm from Texas, so if I speak too slowly, let me know. Before we get into this, also a small disclosure. Ian Glazer and I have a small bet going to see who can use the most amount of slides. We'll just see how this ends up working out. Before we get into the authentication idea here, again, my name's Josh, and in almost any dinner party conversation, I turn the conversation to authentication within about 3.5 minutes. So we have about 3 minutes now for me to talk about kind of the preamble stuff before we get into it. So I'd like to start with perspective. Perspective is incredibly important. It shapes the way we see things, and like our parents, we all have them, and the older they get, the stranger things become. And within perspectives, I'd like to do a little exercise real quick to see how we can reshift our images and our ideas of perspective today. So this is the participation portion. In fact, there are several participation portions of this presentation. That's an alliteration for you. And so let's go ahead and get started. What do you see here? Or said another way, how does this make you feel? Fuzzy, okay, good. Let's go with warm and fuzzy. Warm and fuzzy, I can take that too. Now, how do you feel about the same thing, right? Slightly different, shift perspective, get a little bit different representation. Another one here, what do you see? A snail, and so you shift perspective just a little bit, and it becomes a man-eating snail, right? So I'm a big fan of sidewalk art. Here's another one that looks like a soggy Cheerio, and if you tilt perspective a little bit, it's now a class 5 rapid, right? And so there's a whole lot of stuff out on the internet when it comes to perspective. There's a whole series of very large people doing completely impractical things with small vehicles. So these aren't really incredibly useful, and then there's this entire series of people ingesting things as well. But again, it's a matter of perspective. What is it that you see, and how do you do this? And so that's non sequitur number one. Number two, real quick, is just a basic review of statistics. I know we've all taken basic stat, and we remember that you've got mean and standard deviation, and you've got your histogram. And the thing I want to focus on for 5 seconds is the null hypothesis, right? It's the least intuitive aspect of this stuff. It's essentially how you set the state of the world so you can disprove it, so that you can have a statistically viable representation that the new state of the world is actually what you want it to be. Okay, so let's end there. So within the fact that we've got now this statistical representation of the world, we can envelop the fact that there are certain universal truths, right? North is always up. There's no such thing as too much Michael Bublé, and we all love, and I do mean love, standing in line in airport security lines, right? So let's take a step back and think about how this applies to authentication, right? So a long, long time ago, and I mean a long time ago, back before I could drink or even rent a car, airport security had this frame of the world that said, in fact, that I, Josh, am a pretty good guy. I'm decent, right? And so I've got the important stuff with me that I'm going to keep in my pocket. I can leave it in my pocket, right? And this is, the cutting edge technology. And that when it comes to those bottles of water that I love to drink, I can take those with me through security, and I don't have to necessarily throw them away. In order to repurchase them at Cinnabon for $4 a bottle. And so we know, unfortunately, how this null hypothesis, that in fact I'm a good person, turns out. From the state of the world perspective, we know how this ends. It doesn't end well, right? So what we've done now is we've changed the null hypothesis, and airport security, now we can refer to as TSA, now has a different viewpoint of the world, right? And so in fact, it's not treating me any longer as a good person, but when I walk into an airport, now I'm met with this, right? And so now it's arguable that we have better security when it comes to going through those security lines. And so by changing our null hypothesis to Arteris, we've upgraded our security. We have not had a similar event happen in the recent future, recent past. But at the same time, we've traded off security now for getting more security. We've now conceded some level of usability, because I would not consider this the optimized user experience. That's just me. Again, you guys can draw your own conclusions. But then even a few months later, thanks to Richard Reed, we no longer have the null hypothesis that in fact you're now a terrorist. We've now changed it to in fact you're a shoe bomber, right? And so now what do we have to do every single time we go through security? We have to effectively assert the fact that I'm no longer a shoe bomber, or I've never been a shoe bomber. And I have to suffer through not only having to prove it myself, but I have to necessarily witness everybody else go through the same level of assertion. And what this means is I'm now able to find the artifacts of this legacy process because I now have a memorialized catalog of a great number of elderly people's ankles, right? This is just something you see. And the more and more you have to deal with these unpleasantries, the more and more it's a representation that the current schema that you've got is ill-equipped to deal with modern. And so, again, elderly people ankles, it's a hard slogan to really use. So if we consider the fact that we can just abbreviate this, and they've got some basic bloat and they don't have the power that they really need, so I think we can probably just abbreviate it as IPA. So now let's take this into two-factor authentication, or authentication in general, right? All right, so how do we get to there? What do you see? A black dot. Okay, so this might be one of the most abrasive perspective shifts that I want to push you guys through today, but the fact of the matter is I think this is really the representation of where we stand when it comes to how we deal with authentication today. I think we're really staring down the barrel of a gun because what we're doing is we're treating session authentication as just typically the login, and as a result we're essentially just staring here at this opening, waiting for the bullet to hit us and not acknowledging that there are other factors at work within a session that could enable us to do more within this, right? And so we're focusing on the lock on the door, but less concerned about what actually happens when that door gets open. And so with regard to modern or the typical authentication process today, it's essentially doing this, right, which is not good enough. So I want to propose essentially a shift in perspective, which is to, well, I guess before we even get there, the purpose of the session, right, is not just the login. I don't go to Schwab to log in. I go to Schwab to transfer money, to pay a bill, to buy a stock. These are the critical actions enabled, right? And so as a result of me having to assert myself and my identity every single time I log in and create that friction and that hassle, what I wind up doing is have to prove with the null hypothesis that essentially that I in fact am me. But this becomes, again, the perennial IPA, right? Because if it's really me doing the thing that I always do normally, why should I have to endure this level of friction, right? And it's not just me, because again, I do like myself, but the fact of the matter is this is what we're subjugating not just our employees to, but actually our customers and our users, right? So this is a big problem. Why should they have to bear the burden of creating this hassle and dealing with this IPA? And there you go. In fact, we can almost put a tattoo on it that you are not you. That becomes the perennial IPA when it comes to authentication. So I think here's the proposition. We change perspective. We no longer treat session authentication as a single act play. It's not a one-act play. It's not Chekhov's marriage proposal. Yes, I had to look that up. And so from the standpoint of right now, Act 1 is just log in. They go through the door and I hope everything goes well, right? Let's change perspective. What if, and again, I had no idea that Children of Men was a 3-act play. That's what Wikipedia is for, right? But you change it to the fact that you've got the login process, and so that's Act 1. Act 2 is the meat. This is where something actually happens. This is why I went there in the first place. And then also, let's be good stewards of our online community. Act 3, we actually want people to log out securely as well, right? And so we have a 3-act play, and I think this fits really actually quite well with what Mance was talking about when it comes to the threat levels here, is that you can really focus these in on the critical actions. These are the things that are really important, and you can spend less time trying to bother people in Act 1 and Act 3. So the question then becomes, well, if we've already got the system in place by which we're putting a challenge to an individual user every time they log in, how do we actually then have to deploy a challenge to them intra-session as well, right? Because this is going to create, again, possibly even more IPAs. So the idea here is how do you take this burden and shift this from Act 1 to Act 2? And so I think the first way we can typically apply this, and you see most often, is we just acknowledge the fact that, okay, well, how about we just challenge the user in Act 1, and we challenge the user again when they're trying to do something important. And in a real-world context, what this looks like is, well, I'll just ask you to pull your phone out of your pocket and press a button, and then I'll just ask you to pull your phone out of your press your button again. And so, and again, historically, I'm only aware of really one scientific example when pushing a button actually yields a good result. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, this is a very, very old picture of a rat. There was a psychological experiment I done 50, 100 years ago where essentially you could press a button, or the rat would press a button. They have two different buttons. One would essentially yield food, the other one would essentially yield an orgasm. And you can only imagine which one the rat pushed over and over and over and over again. So from a scientific standpoint, anytime you're asking a user to push a button over and over and over again, what it really will culminate in is a room full of dead rats just covered in their fur. I didn't go there. So what else does this lead to, right? Well, it leads to repetition poisoning as well. And so what is repetition poisoning? Well, I think it's best described when it comes to every time we have to update our iTunes account, right? So you have to update your iTunes, you restart the application, it launches an agreement, you press agree, and you have access to all of the Taylor Swift you could possibly want. But the question is, for everybody in this room, the technical elite, when was the last time you actually read that contract, right? So we don't, because it's just so easy to press that agree button, right? And so from that perspective, if you essentially are prompting the user and training the user just to pull something out of their pocket and press a button every single time they log in, you're very going to quickly train them to just press allow every time anything happens. And that's a huge security vulnerability, because now you're not only getting rid of the security, now you're just meaningfully hassling your user for no reason. And both of those things are bad. So is repetition poisoning real? How do you prove it? Let me actually just go ahead and show you a test. This is a test of repetition poisoning. The next participation portion of the presentation, we are now in it. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. These are the answers to the next 3 questions. If you can't read them, they're ilk, bilk, and silk. Here's question number 1. What fiber does a silkworm produce? Silk. Good. Okay. Very good. What's another word for defraud? Bilk. Good. You see, you guys are so good. I appreciate this. What word would you use to describe a person or thing similar to which you've previously referred? Andrew Nash used it twice yesterday in his presentation. It's ilk. That's right. Okay, you guys did so well. Let's do a couple bonus questions really quick. What do cows drink? Right. Okay. And if you don't believe me, there are plenty of pictures of cows not drinking out of lakes of milk. They, in fact, drink water, right? Calves drink milk, cows drink water. But here's the issue, right? You guys, again, you're the technorati, you're the technologically elite. I told you that was a repetition poisoning test. And you guys, or some of you, could be led astray in a matter of 20 seconds. So my question is, for the average user, for my mom who's a high school English teacher, what hope is there for her, right? Okay, so my gut tells me that when it comes to just over-challenging the user, probably not the right way to go. Okay, good. Let's put that to bed. So then how do you really do it? What is the answer? I think you're looking at it. Invisibility, right? Okay, now I'm going to be fair. Invisibility is not a panacea. It does not cure everything, right? Unless you're a raging douchebag, invisible art is terrible. Traffic lights, can't make those invisible. We've tried really, really hard, but invisible bridges just don't quite work. And I've got one word for you: teeth. But there are things that invisibility does work really, really well for, right? So if you consider high fashion of the 1800s, or I think if you're Ian Glazer's hipster, if you can possibly wear a cloak, ironically, maybe, but I think that if you add a pinch of invisibility, it makes the cloak a whole lot better, right? Don't really care what side of the aisle you sit on. When it comes to 92% of the American public, they would definitely prefer Congress if they were invisible as well. So how do we take invisibility and make it something practical? How do we actually do it? Well, there's, again, the most common way we do it today, which is essentially just to make believe. And so when you consider the fact that if we just rely on device rec, and so every time you enter a password, you can essentially just have that computer recognized for about 30 days, that's not really doing it, right? Because username and password and device rec does not stand up to the man on the mobile attack. It doesn't stand up to the man on the browser attack. It doesn't stand up to an endpoint attack. So these are being effectively disingenuous when it comes to these levels of protection. And if we talk about it from a more quantitative standpoint, if you have to do this every 30 days, right, what you're talking about is once every 30 days, and if you have some sort of re-authentication process into your system that happens 3 or 4 times a day, what you're really talking about is a multi-factor authentication process at about 1% frequency, right? And let's just be honest with ourselves. Authentication at a 1% frequency is kind of a joke, right? So we want to be very, very careful about this, but we also want to be very clear, which is that invisibility is not the same thing as omission, right? Invisible Woman wasn't invisible because she wasn't there. Invisible Woman is invisible because she's there and you can't see her. And that is a key nuance to define what we want to do when it comes to security, right? So the other side to security, and this is something we've talked about a lot in the last couple of days as well, is again, so, okay, we can't just pretend we've done invisibility. How can we actually do it? Well, let's focus on the other side of authentication, right, which is that paradigm of you have security, you have usability. We spend a lot of time focusing on security. Let's talk about usability for a second. What is an optimized user experience? Well, after talking to thousands of people who you ask them, what kind of security solution do you want to use, they will tell you, I don't want to use a security solution. Okay, great. So what does an invisible security solution look like? It's one that does not modify a user's human behavior, right? If you can give it to them effectively for free, both from an economic standpoint and from a user experience standpoint, this is how you can get better adoption, right? And here's the really cool thing, is that we've got these things with us, and we take them everywhere we go, and they know a whole lot of things about us, right? And we can just leave them in our pockets. This is not a foreign site, right? Well, maybe for some of you. This is not a foreign site. So essentially, you have them with you everywhere you go, and you never even have to take them out of your pocket. And that's because we can rely on something that's really cool, context. And this, again, we've used the word context a lot in the last few days as well. I'd like to clarify when I'm talking about context. And I don't want to be so bold as to call it context 2.0 or 1.1 or something. But context, what we've traditionally talked about context has been the context of a session, right? Well, is this the right endpoint that's usually accessing this web service at this point of day? That's good. It's very important. But I want to challenge us to move forward when we talk about the context of an individual. I want to know the context of Mance. I want to know that I've got now a digital proxy for a lot of things that he can now, or effectively the phone or the mobile device, can attest to his behavior and to his being and not have to prompt him for these things, right? And so these are really, really cool things, and we can draw on this context now to increase the availability for us to drive invisibility. And these things that we can now use are going to be things like Wi-Fi stations, Bluetooth stations, NFC stations, ambient noise, ambient lighting, accelerometer, kinetics, biometrics, time, temperature, altimeter, and barometer, right? There's a lot of things out there that we can start to bring into these things, and then we can centralize all of these factors and all of these aspects of context around the centralized repository of mobile device, right? This can be now that thing that can attest to the fact that I am who I say I am, where I say I am, when I say I am, and effectively within the same barometric pressure of where I normally am, right? And I'm kind of going a little bit fast through that stuff, but I want to make sure everybody has time to speak. So how can we augment this, right? Okay, well, let's take another step back for just a second. This is a given, right? I think that if anybody disagrees with this statement, they found themselves at the wrong conference. Identity is valuable, and identity is valuable for several reasons, but how do we make it even more valuable, right? We can make it more valuable by adding dimensionality to it, by adding more features, functions, and robustness to the quality of it, we can make it more valuable by making sure that it has the trust and security around it to ensure that it's really the right person who's asserting that identity, right? And so taking one more step back, I'm a huge nerd, right? And I'm a huge nerd for many reasons, but one of the most significant right now is probably the fact that I'm wearing 3 watches, right? And so I've got multiple wearables on because they all serve one single purpose in my life right now. I'm wearing a Pebble because I want to know a more socially optimized way to check my tweets while I'm giving a presentation in CIS. I've got a Fitbit because now after 33 years I realize I can't go without knowing how many steps I've taken in any given day. And a year ago, without my basis, I used to wake up in the morning and go, I must have slept well. Now I have a quantitative score at the end of the day to tell me exactly how well I slept, right? And so essentially I've got a biometric built into this, and this is really cool. But here's the thing. Now I can use these as the next level of ways to identify me and provide more context, and I mean context in that 2.0 sense, about me specifically, and I can now let these relay and pivot on top of the fact that I've now got my mobile authentication platform, which I can transmit all of this stuff to begin with. So that's really, really interesting. So the last part of this, oh, sorry, there, that's probably better, is leveraging this Internet of Things. Again, we've got smart blenders, we've got smart televisions, we've got all sorts of things that can communicate and can give even more assertion that I am who I say I am, where I say I am, when I say I am, without having to affect the user experience. Again, bringing this all into the idea of invisibility. But here's the aspect. If you prompt a user and tell them they have to do something from a security standpoint, you're giving all of the benefit to the RP and you're not giving the benefit to the user. And as a result, if you're giving these people these types of wearables, devices, or what have you, you find you get very poor adoption of these types of wearables. So what do you do? House of cards. This is not being dirty. House of cards. Okay. So how do you do this? Well, you don't play it as a security play. This is the consumerization of IT. These are things that we're using on a daily basis because we want to use them anyway. And if you can now tilt the scale back in the favor of providing the benefit, the net benefit, now to the end user, as opposed to necessarily giving it to the RP, you can have much, much better adoption. And so the thesis here to focus on is that context can create invisibility, and invisibility can enable greater security. So everybody wins in this regard. But wait, there's more. We've only gotten through the first 2 acts. Luckily, I can go a little bit faster through the last one, right? Act 3. What's the last thing you did when you left your house before coming to this conference? Was it A, wash oversized child hands, have a very affected way of tying a shoe, or lock your front door or back door? I'm hoping hoping that everybody's secured where they live, right? And this is redundant. This is normal to us. When we get out of our car, we walk away and it locks automatically, or we press the button and it locks. The same thing from a house. This is not the way that people behave online for online authenticated sessions, right? When it comes to when you're online or when you're doing something within a session, when you're in front of your computer, you should have access to that session. But when you get up and walk away and leave a severed hand on top of the computer, then you no longer need access to that session. And the fact of the matter is, you're taking that phone with you, that mobile device with you everywhere you go, and it knows so many things. It knows who you are, it knows when you are, it knows where you are, it knows what you did last summer. There's so many things about this that you can draw on. And again, it's focusing on this construct of invisibility. So if you can optimize the user experience, you can get the better adoption. Better adoption is better security. And again, context creates invisibility, and invisibility enables security. So let's sum it up real quick, right? If we can change our perspective, and by doing so, identify the EPAs, the elderly people angles, associated with our current systems, we can actually address a lot of the problems that we find within authentication today. So again, treat it as a 3-act play. Act 1 is the login. Act 3 is the log out. Both of these things can and should be effectively invisible to the end user, right? If you can make it easy to get in and easy to leave, then you can focus on the really important thing, which is in the middle, right? That's when the drama really happens. And if you can do that, you can mitigate a whole lot of not just current attacks, but also a lot of the preeminent future ones that we're going to continue to see even more widespread use of. If you shift the perspective, you can see your EPA. If you can enable invisibility, you will be able to actually enable security. And invisibility has many, many qualities to it, but it also gets rid of those ugly elderly people angles. And so, in closing, great. What do I do with this? Well, I think when it comes to the representation of adopting standards or talking about how we can move forward in a way that we can actually have a unified vision of how we can use authentication more productively within the mobile architecture, it's essentially we can start to talk about what are the laws of modern multi-factor authentication. And they're 3, and they're easy. First, tell the user what they're doing. Not every single time, but at least the first time, tell them what they're doing. Because I still don't know what 630999 means when I get that as a text message. I don't know who's doing what, on, where, from, where, when, right? But if you can tell the user everything that's going on the first time and enable them to make a good decision, then you can defeat MIT, you can defeat man in the browser, man in the middle, and endpoint attacks in that regard. The second is communicate completely out of band. Not partially out of band, completely out of band. You need to have a completely separate channel by which you can communicate with the end user. That way it's not affected by any potential vulnerability in that regard. And the third is you have to get out of their way. Right? You have to make it an optimized user experience, and I think it can be pretty well asserted here that the closer you can get to invisibility, the more likely it is that somebody's going to adopt these. So these are the 3 rules of modern multi-factor authentication. Use them as a litmus test. Use them as a standard. Use them to make sure that you're giving the right sense of authority and user experience to your end users. And I've been told that I should really, really close strongly, so I'm done. Thank you guys very much.